Alright, this video is intended to help Canyon Aeroad owners understand the construction and design of their headset and front end in case they need to overhaul their headset or are intending to switch their cockpit, the CP0018, to a different length stem. This applies to a 2024 Canyon Aeroad, but the current generation essentially all use the same CP0018 headset, and now the Canyon Ultimate also uses a similar headset setup to hide the cables inside the handlebar and headset with adjustable handlebar width. I apologize for the relatively low production quality of this video, but this is not intended to be a Jasper Philipson or Annemiek van Vleuten Canyon dream build where you're trying to freeze frames and see what did that pro mechanic do there or not. It's intended to help you understand the nitty-gritty of how the headset is put together and how to take it apart and how it functions safely. So to start with, I'm going to bring you in and go through a few things that I found on my bike when I disassembled it that I think are relevant considerations for most folks if you are going to be disassembling your headset and going to all the trouble of doing this. So first of all, Canyon uses an extremely sort of soft, almost just styrofoam material for their housing or cable hose, hydraulic hose churro, and that enters in through the back of the stem. And this bike was ridden less than 2 or 3 weeks, and it was already all chewed up and starting to contact the hydraulic hose itself. So I would recommend, if you're taking this apart, just rip off a small section of that and put on some beefier churro hose protectant, rattle prevention there. The other thing that I found when I took this bike apart is, again, this bike is 2 or 3 weeks old. It was ridden in one relatively rainy stage race, and the headset bearings were already showing some signs of exterior rust. They spin smoothly, the seals seem good, but in terms of their material, I think they're probably zinc-coated bearings, not stainless steel. And this is a huge pain in the ass, so if you're going to go to all this trouble, I would recommend considering upgrading to stainless steel bearings. Enduro is the only ones that I found that make suitable bearings for this, so I'll show the part numbers for that in a second when we look at the construction of the cockpit itself. I think that's about it for notable things that I found upon disassembly. So let's cut to the parts themselves and the construction of the fork and the steerer tubes so that folks can understand what's actually happening inside their quill stem and their steerer tube so they understand how the headset works and doesn't come apart. Okay, so let's go through the relevant parts of the cockpit and headset as well as the fork so that we have sort of a general overview of how this goes together. So we'll start with just the fork steerer itself and the center section of the handlebar. So for those of you who are old school and know what a quill stem is, you know, back in the day when we had threaded headsets, we had 1-inch steel steerer tubes, and our stem actually had a section that extended down called the quill that would go into the center of the steerer tube, and it had a metal wedge that would expand out, and that's what locked the stem in place. It was a cool system because you essentially had easy adjustment up and down inside the steerer tube, which didn't even involve the headset at all. You didn't need spacers, didn't need anything like that. It was a good system, but it was heavy and it required steel or strong aluminum to function and not explode. So Canyon has sort of taken a unusual approach to hiding their cables inside of this system. Instead of the quill, in this case, going inside of the steerer, it actually goes outside of the steerer. So you can see that the diameter of the quill coming off of the stem is larger than the steerer tube itself. Obviously, the other highly unusual thing about this fork steerer tube is the fact that it's missing the rear section. And the reason it's missing the rear section is so that inside the head tube of the bike, the hydraulic hose and any wiring for DI2 can travel through the back of this opening in the quill into the steerer tube and up into the stem itself and out to your controls on the handlebars. It's pretty unusual. The way that this all clamps together is even more unusual. So you have the mechanism to preload the headset is these threads in the top of the steerer. There's this aluminum piece that's bonded into the top of the steerer, and you have a hole in the top of your stem to use this tool to thread into the top of the steerer. When you're done preloading the headset, you're told to remove this tool and just replace it with this plug, this rubber plug. Now, those who are very keen-eyed and scared that their entire headset assembly is held together by one jam bolt alone might have noticed that our friend Matthew Vanderpool, when doing the Spring Classics, had a different stem. He always at least had a bolt here, and in one case he had a different stem entirely that had a top cap assembly as a backup so his couldn't come loose. The design of this is actually relatively ingenious, though, to prevent it from coming loose. So this is the T25 bolt that one tightens on the headset itself to tighten the headset assembly, and you loosen it to move the stem up and down, add spacers as in Canyon's videos. And basically, sorry, I need like 4 hands here. This piece goes inside of your quill like that, and when the bolt is tightened, this steel jam, I guess I'll call it shoulder, presses forward, and you can see the sort of the marks, the witness marks from where it's pressed into this aluminum insert here into the stem. And as it presses into that, it pushes this part of the steerer tube into the front part of the quill, and it also pushes itself into the back of the quill here, and in turn just sort of holds the steerer tight inside the quill and essentially makes it one piece. Now, in watching some videos online and reading some sort of armchair criticisms of this system, typically if you just had that one jam bolt holding the whole thing together, anytime you had vibration or shock load to the system, it's possible that this could actually migrate up and your headset would loosen. And since you don't have a preload bolt still in there, it could loosen theoretically. However, it's difficult to tell on camera, but the face of this insert is actually slanted slightly backwards. And so in order for this to slide up, in order for the jam bolt to slide up the face of this aluminum insert, it would become even tighter as it attempted to migrate up. So in my 3 weeks on the bike, and I tend to make headsets come loose pretty easily, I've honestly not had any problems. Now, whether Matthew Vanderpool has had problems on Paris-Roubaix or Flanders, I don't know. But the system does seem to work. I mean, I don't like the idea of the only thing keeping the whole front end of my bike together, and therefore my face from meeting the ground being one bolt, but that's the way the Canyon's designed it, and it seems like this has not been a problematic design for them because they've extended this also now to the Ultimate as well. So that's sort of like the general design of it. In terms of the headset itself, it's not that atypical. It's a little bit weird. You have, your center section here. This collar goes on the outside and locates your jam bolt inside. Then after that, you just have essentially a compression ring, which is, again, somewhat weird and atypical in that it's sort of like rubbery, but it is a split ring as one would normally have. And then you just have a top cap there to prevent water ingress. And then you have your split spacers, which is not uncommon these days. And then you have your bearings. Now, one thing that is odd is the bearings, they're the same external diameter, top and bottom, which is 44 millimeters. These are, I believe, made by Acros. The weird thing is that the top bearing uses a larger inner diameter than the lower bearing. And that is because here, our quill has a larger external diameter than the fork steer tube itself. So that means that your ball bearings inside the upper bearing are going to be smaller than the ball bearings in the lower bearing. So, and I just wanted to show you guys that the upper bearing has some, this is after cleaning it pretty extensively, even with some 3M sort of Brillo pad, and it's got sort of rust that's already started and formed on it. And the lower bearing looks a little bit better, but the lower bearing honestly feels grittier than the top. And again, that's after just one weekend of a relatively rainy stage race. When I took this all apart, there was relatively minimal grease on the bearings, and they are using white lithium grease, which is not my favorite in terms of water resistance, tenacity to prevent corrosion. So, if you get a new one and you're taking it apart and you want to reuse your bearings, I would at least recommend using a higher quality grease than the white lithium that they use in there. These are the Enduro replacement stainless steel bearings. They appear essentially identical in dimension and measured out the same. These are the part numbers for those two bearings. You can screenshot that if you'd like. Okay, so that's about it. Let's move to... So the first step to starting reassembly of the front end of the Aeroad, move you guys here for a second, is going to be putting the bottom headset bearing in. So not sure if you remember from before, but both headset bearings have the same outer diameter, but the lower one has a smaller inner diameter because, again, the fork steer is actually a smaller diameter than the quill on the coming off the stem. The Aeroad has this really cool little device that screws into the bottom of the head tube here that prevents the handlebars from rotating so much that they would contact the top tube and cause damage. So you're going to want to grease your lower bearing, and again, remember, this grease is not necessarily to prevent water ingress into your bearing, though it will do that to some degree, but it's to prevent the outer surface of the bearing from rusting. So just make sure your head tube is like super nice and clean before you insert your bearing. And then this little guy, not sure what size Torx it is, but I guess it's a T20 Torx. And this just screws in to the bottom of the head tube here. Just make sure it lines up well with the frame. There's an obvious indentation in the frame here where it goes. Doesn't need to be super tight. Just preventing your headset from over-rotating there. You can see on the fork here, there's shoulders below where the headset bearing sits that will contact that stop and prevent it from over-rotating. So the next step is going to be putting the fork into the frame. And you're going to just route your hydraulic hose up through the head tube. Get her into position there. And then I'm using these zip ties to hold us together. Wish I had that super slick Canyon tool. Coming back for attempt number 2. I wasn't super pumped on how my zip tie solution was holding the fork because it caused it to rotate as well. So let's try again. Okay, so you can see here, not the most beautiful solution, but I essentially attempted to emulate Canyon's cool foam holder using some foam pipe insulation there, and that seems pretty good. Okay, so we'll move on to the next step now, which is pre-assembly of the stem and top. Okay, at this point, we're going to start our pre-assembly of the center section handlebar quill stem. You're going to start by putting some carbon assembly paste on the inside of the quill here, all throughout, because this is where the steer is going to, the steer from the fork is going to meet the quill, and also our jam nut assembly is going to sit inside of there. We're also going to put some carbon assembly paste on the inside of our top collar, which locates our bolt for the jam nut assembly that goes inside. And then, probably just for good measure, I'm going to put some carbon assembly paste on the face of our jam nut assembly here. I did put some Vibratite VC3 on this bolt, just since it's the only thing holding it together. I mean, I already explained that it really can't come loose if properly torqued, just from shock load of the headset. but since it's one bolt keeping my face from meeting the ground, I'd really prefer that it not come loose after torqued. Okay, so this is a little bit tricky, but you're gonna essentially, you gotta get your collar on. It can only go on one way because there's locating pins on the bottom of the stem and each layer there. And then we're gonna move it up on the quill here, and then we need to basically drop our jam nut assembly in. It's labeled top, so make sure that that's going in the right direction. It's a bit of a pain in the neck because you got to get this both dropped in there, and when it drops in, it needs to be located in the bolt hole for the collar. Not the easiest thing. Not even easy to get it out, honestly. Might take a few attempts. Just take your time. Okay, so there we go. We're located. Now, Canyon, then we'll just slide it all the way up into position there. If you remove your finger from the inside, it's going to fall out of position. Canyon says to use a small rubber plug to hold that in place. I don't have anything like that, so I'm going to try a small piece of Gorilla Tape to hold it in position and try to not shake it around too much. Once it is on the bike with the fork in position, it really can't fall out of position. Okay, so next on our assembly is our top seal here. That also has a locating pin near the front of the stem. So that goes into position as well. Okay, and then we have our compression ring, which I would put some grease on, not carbon paste, because we want this to be able to slide freely and compress. And then I always try to avoid putting the split in the compression ring front or rear on the headset, just because of the additional loads there under braking. So I usually put it to the side. That kind of holds everything together. And then we can actually put our headset bearing on now. Grease that up so it has some additional rust protection even though it's stainless steel, and will self-locate better in the chamfers of the frame. And that is our assembly put together. So now the only other thing we need to do to prep to start going onto the bike is get ready to pull our brake hose through. So our rear brake hose is going to come through this slot under the bearing before going up through the bearing. And obviously, so I know this is upside down, but this is the right side of the handlebar. And I'm just going to try to get this into the front channel of the handlebars. I know some people say it should run in the rear channel. I'm going to be coming out because I've got SRAM levers here. So I'm going to be in the front channel, and I don't have anything in the rear channel since I'm not DI2. Get my little magnet here. All right, I'll cut back once I've got this located in position. Okay, we're back. I was successful. I would say a few tips. Your most acute angle is going to be right here inside the stem, And like I said, this park tool was really helpful. It'd be great if you have someone to hold the center stem quill assembly for you, because you kind of need to push and pull at the same time. Pushing the hydraulic hose and pulling from this end with your guide. This magnetic park tool pick was really helpful in picking up the magnet from the inside of the handlebars when it finally appeared in the center section here. Though it may not appear so, my hoses are going on the correct side of the jam nut. You're going to need a headlamp to see that. And as you pull this all together, you're going to want to be glancing in there and make sure that they remain in that position. Down here, we're reversed currently, and my fork keeps trying to fall down despite my super high quality fork holder here. So let's see if I can kind of shimmy this down into position here. You're going to basically just be feeding and pulling from each end. This is very fiddly, very messy with all the grease and carbon fiber paste. Again, having 2 sets of hands would be super helpful right now. Just want to keep checking that your hoses are going where they should be. Luckily, with the bolt in place, it kind of, and the acute angle that they're making there, the hoses somewhat stay in position for us. All right, so we're starting to come down here. Just, a little bit at a time. The fork is a pretty tight, fork steer is a pretty tight fit inside the steerer. Just keep glancing in there. Make sure you're on the... Okay, we're together. Few tips. It's just extremely fiddly. It's probably much easier to actually have your cranks and bottom bracket out. I already have a one-piece bottom bracket in this bike, so that would be quite a pain. Just because the hardest part is actually manipulating the rear brake hose, so it's not under too much or too little tension when this is all sort of coming together. But I am together. I have to say, I'm a little bit not super pumped on how these enduro bearings feel when preloaded. A part of me wonders if they're just slightly different in tolerance, allowing maybe the top compression ring seal to come down on the frame a little bit more. And I also was getting some noise inside the frame from the rear brake hose until I sort of played with it down here at the bottom bracket. But I ended up having to undo the rear caliper as well to kind of manipulate the hose and tension as this was all coming together. But it seems like I have enough now for assembly and for travel. It doesn't feel amazing, but I think it will be serviceable, and I'd rather have the stainless steel bearings in there than the original ones. So that's how you put it together. One final note is, if you've made it this far, is that The center section is actually different once you get above. Sorry, my camera's freaking out there. The center section is actually different when you get 100 millimeters or above. So 90 millimeters and below, your minimum width is 37, and 100 millimeters and above, your minimum width is 39. They also are different in cross section, they're girthier, and the drops are bigger as well. So you won't be able to just trade a center section if you're 100 or above with somebody who's 90 and below, or vice versa. So sorry for the video being so long, but I mean, it's a long, fiddly process to do anything with this headset, so, you know, that's sort of the nature of the beast. So hope this helps some people. Have a good, okay, final update here. I ended up pulling this all back apart again. I just wasn't happy with how the, got a helper here, how the headset was moving, and it was that upper bearing. So I guess I can't recommend the Enduro upper bearing, but typically the lower bearing is what's going to get the most water exposure anyway. So I have the Acros original bearing up top and the Enduro bearing down below, and even with a fair amount of preload here, it still spins real smooth. The other thing I would say is you don't really want to have any churro for the hose entering into the quill stem, because, excuse me, yes, I will pet you in a second, excuse me, I'm distracted, because it can kind of make the headset feel like it's binding. So, and as you feed the top down, it's very difficult, but you want to be trying to force some rear hose back into the down tube. Just so you know, the hose is secured with a zip tie here at the bottle cage mounts, which is also somewhat of a pain. So, you know, I mean, this is the modern bikes, the age of modern bikes that we live in. I mean, basically, to replace your headset bearings, you essentially need to, I mean, the easiest way would be to pull your bottom bracket and have full access to your hose front to back. But such are the prices we pay for full-on aero. So I hope this video helps someone. I'm sorry it's so long. Yeah, feel free to comment with questions.